Having said that, though, I think, and again, going back to my first experience with the climate change process in Copenhagen, and then further on, my first experience as a minister in the climate change negotiations in Doha, we have to recognize that ministers approach climate change negotiations from a totally different vantage point and a totally different perspective to our climate change negotiators. And I distinctly remember my first meeting, my first COP as a minister in Doha, being thrust by Don Pierre-Nathaniel into a negotiating meeting on loss and damage. And Don egging me on to say, Minister, you need to intervene on this and intervene on that. And my style is one that if I do not understand an issue completely, then I won't speak on it. I have no difficulty in asking for the floor for my negotiator to speak. But you see, I find it a little difficult to make an intervention based on a slip of paper that has been put in front of me. And then when it's necessary that I come back, I don't know, and I have to be turning to the person next to me and saying, okay, what do I say next? And I think that really highlights the challenge that ministers face in climate change negotiations, which is why it is extremely important for meetings such as this one, not just as a one-off, but as a continual process where ministers are briefed and informed and apprised of all of the issues that we are dealing with, all of the emerging issues in the climate change negotiations. Because your utility as a minister is diminished when it is apparent to everyone around you that you're basically serving as a mouthpiece for the negotiator who is next to you. Your utility really has to be, and when you're really useful to your negotiators is when you understand the material, you own it, and you can speak on it. Not speak on it with scientific certainty. That's the role of the technical people around you. But that you understand the issues well enough that you could speak intelligently on it and keep a conversation on it. And I do not know that all of us in this room and those of us who are not able to attend have reached that point of familiarity with the material, and that is extremely important. And that really highlights the amount of work that we have to do as ministers, and we have to commit ourselves to doing as ministers between now and, well, I can't even say between now and Paris, because Paris is not the end. There is so much work that has to happen between now and Paris. But it's not just for ministers, though, and I'm going to speak a little indelicately here today, which I do sometimes. But there's also a role for regional institutions, and I'm very happy that Dr. Jules, under your leadership, the OECS Commission has stepped up to the plate. I cannot say the same, and I'm very sorry, but I cannot say the same for the CARICOM Secretariat, and it's a point I've made to the Secretary General. It's a point I've made to the Assistant Secretary General for Human and Social Development. We need to see a greater involvement of CARICOM in this process. I know they have established the Regional Task Force on Sustainable Development, which I have the honor of chairing, but more effort, more attention, and more resources need to be put in so that we can speak with one voice as a CARICOM grouping, not just at the COPs, but before the COPs. There is need for greater coordination. And I'm very happy that there is a quoted on sustainable development and also a quoted on energy next week in Guyana. And you can rest assured that I will be making that point. I don't know whether I'll be allowed back out of Ghana, but I will be making that point very forcefully. And also, the 5 Cs. And Carlos, I have to thank you for the work that you have done with the high-level support mechanism. But I think the role of the 5 Cs also has to be re-examined, because there is a wealth of technical experience, a wealth of knowledge residing within the 5 Cs. And we as member states would like to see the 5 Cs more involved with us in the trenches, in the negotiations. When you have the likes of Ken Leslie, Ulrich Trotz, Dr. Nurse, who accompanied us to Lima, that role, that volume, that breadth of knowledge and experience cannot just be used by the 5 Cs going around to lobby on behalf of themselves. We want to see that support in the negotiating meetings with us, and I think it's an issue that I will raise with Ken Leslie and with the 5 Cs. You do not fall in that category, but I think we have to find a different role for the, and I did apologize, I did say I'd be a little indelicate this morning, but we're going into very difficult negotiations, and the odds are stacked against us, and we have to ensure that we have the support of everybody in this, and we can't just be there for the optics. We have to be there to add some value to this, and this is something that I think we really have to pay attention to. As ministers, we not we're not absent of blame. We also have to understand that as difficult as it is, we need to attend the meetings that are set up for us and the meetings where we as ministers can interface. Last year, for example, the European Union convened 2 informal ministerials, one in Brussels and one in New York, on the eve of Ban Ki-moon's special summit on climate change. I wanted to see more of my Caribbean ministers in those informal ministerials. I did not. AOSIS scheduled a meeting of AOSIS ministers in the Seychelles last year. I think it was in November. Again, I didn't see enough of my Caribbean ministers in there with me. All of these meetings are extremely important for us to develop joint positions and to discuss with each other so that when we go into negotiations, one, there's a familiarity with each other, and secondly, there's some level of division of labor that takes place. So we know, okay, my Lizelle from Belize will be my champion on long-term financing, and well, Dennis, you're a champion on so many things. I can't say what you should focus on, but that's the sort of cooperation and collaboration that is required going into these meetings, and that's why it's extremely important for us to play our part. And I know AOSIS is planning a ministerial in the Maldives, I think in April of this year. The Maldives has now assumed the chairmanship of AOSIS, and I would like to encourage each and every single one of you to please attend that ministerial. I know the Maldives is a long way to go to, but I think it's important that we find ourselves there. We also have to ensure that the issues that are important to us are either reflected or not diminished in some of the negotiations that are taking place and that will culminate this year. And I speak specifically of the post-2015 development agenda, the United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction that takes place in Sendai in Japan, I think in March of this year, and also the World Conference on Financing for Development. The United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, for example, there is a very big push there for us to mainstream response to disasters in national budgets, and we have to fight back against that. We have to ensure that they understand, that the world understands that you cannot ask us to respond to things that are as a result of climate change by using natural resources, our own domestic resources. That has to be made very, very clear, and that seems to be something that is coming out of the whole disaster risk reduction negotiating arena. Now, fortunately, it's not necessary that I highlight any of the important issues relating to climate change, because I'm not here speaking to the converted. I'm speaking to the high priests and the apostles who are leading the crusades. So I don't have to be convincing you of the need for us to pay attention to climate change. But there are 5 announcements and 1 recent activity that I want to highlight here this morning to try to encapsulate the challenge that confronts us. The first is a statement by University College London and the Lancet in a joint collaboration that was repeated by the WHO this year in Lima, that climate change represents the most serious threat to global health in the 21st century. That's the first point. And I think that is almost a self-evident statement. I don't know that very much else needs to be said about that. The second is a presentation by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's another error that we make as climate change people. We run off these acronyms like everybody knows what we're speaking about. So we'll say IPCC and UNFCCC and GHG, and we assume everybody follows what we're saying. And I always have to be imploring my technical officers, explain, say what it is, because not everybody knows IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Not everybody knows GHG is greenhouse gases. So anyway, the chairman of the IPCC, that I just told you what it was, Dr. Ravindra Pachuri, in a presentation in Lima, stated that 65% of the carbon dioxide that we need to emit in order to keep global temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees Celsius has already been emitted. 65% of the CO2. So it shows you just how much of a challenge that we have. If we were to stop, miraculously, emissions of all carbon dioxide today, it will still be a big task for us to keep temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius. And remember that for small island developing states, we said 2 degrees Celsius is not our threshold. Our threshold is 1.5 degrees Celsius. At 2 degrees Celsius, we have to resign ourselves to the fact that some islands will disappear. I mean, that is as real as I can make it. Some islands will disappear. Some bits of our coastlines will disappear. So 1.5 degrees Celsius is what we've been pushing for, but the road to 1.5 degrees Celsius is extremely, extremely difficult. The third is an article that came out in the January publication of Nature, which says that we've been underestimating the level of mean global sea level rise all along, and that the level of global sea level rise relative to the 1901 to 1990 trend is actually higher than we previously thought. Now, think about that with respect to small island developing states in the Caribbean, where we've been told that a 1 meter sea level rise, which we believe is probably the minimum that we'll have to deal with, a 1 meter sea level rise will cause, across the Caribbean, damage to 21 CARICOM airports, loss or damage to 5 power plants, the land surrounding 35 ports being inundated, and 149 tourism resorts being damaged. Our jugular is on our coast. So any sea level rise will affect us where it hits the most. All of our economic and social activity in all of our islands is located on our coastline. So sea level rise is extremely important, and when you now hear that we've been underestimating the level of sea level rise, you understand what we say when we make the point that climate change is an existential threat to small island developing states. The fourth is from the journal Science, again a January publication, January edition, that says that human activity has already pushed our planet past 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries that have been established to guide safe development. And those boundaries are, 1, the rate of species extinction; secondly, the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide; thirdly, deforestation; and fourthly, the rate of flow of nitrogen and phosphorus into our oceans. And on that last one, I probably want, for the sake of my ministerial colleagues here today from St. Lucia, to remind you of that discussion we had in our parliament last year when we were passing the Agricultural Incentives Bill, and why we said it was so important to establish a riparian buffer to limit activity, that agricultural activity that would be close to our watercourses, and the pushback that we got from the opposition, including some former ministers of agriculture, when we tried to push this. And that's why, you know, sometimes making policy is difficult, making policy is painful, but we have to do it because we know what it is we're up against. There's just one kind of frivolous aside I have to all of this. When I read about the rate of species extinction, I asked myself, why couldn't the Aedes aegypti mosquito be one of those species that is disappearing? But that's another issue. The fifth is that 2014 is either the hottest year on record, or it's tied for being the hottest year on record with 2005 and 2010. There's still some discussion about the statistical significance of the temperature increase that we saw in 2014. Putting all of that aside, however, it is an indisputable fact that 11 of the hottest years that we've had and we've experienced on this planet since we started taking measurements in 1880 have occurred between the period of 1998 and now. So those who want to deny global warming, those who want to deny climate change, cannot deny that fact, that 11 of our hottest years have taken place between 1998 and 2014. And the event that I want to speak of is a vote in the US Senate last week. I don't know how many of you follow this, but in a vote on the Keystone XL pipeline, the US Senate voted by 98-1. There was one dissenting voice, a gentleman by the name of Senator Wicker, that climate change is real, it is not a hoax. That was a jaw-dropping, earth-shattering revelation by the US Senate. Now, that's the same Senate. 27 years ago, 1988, one of its own NASA scientists said to Congress that there is a 98-99% probability that not only is climate change real, but climate change is caused by human activity. But that gives me a good segue into the next 2 votes that took place on the floor of the US Senate. By a vote of 59-40, a motion that climate change is caused by human activity was defeated. And by a vote of 50-49, a vote that climate change is significantly caused by human activity was also defeated. Now, one of the biggest opponents to that viewpoint is the chairman of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, a gentleman who shares the same first name with me, James, a senator from Oklahoma called James Inhofe. And he said that he's now backtracked. He used to say that climate change is a hoax. In fact, he did. I think he wrote a book on it. He says climate change is really not a hoax. But the hoax is that there are some people who are so arrogant to think that they are so powerful that they can change the climate. After that vote, he said that he would unleash a truth squad to examine the science of human-made climate change because he sees it as something that liberals are using to justify tax increases. And to support himself, he references the Bible. He says that in Genesis chapter 8, verse 22, and I'm not very good at biblical quotes, so I have to refer to my notes on that one. As long as the earth remains, there will be seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night. So his point is that God is still up there, and it is arrogant of us to believe that we can do anything to change what he is doing to the climate, because the Bible very clearly says that as long as the earth remains, there will be seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are the challenges that confront us, because one of our big, I don't want to use the word adversary because Todd still would be very disappointed if I use the word adversary, but one of our big, I'm looking for a diplomatic correct word, Crispin has gone to the other extreme and told me counterparts. But one of our big counterparts in the climate change negotiations is the United States. And when you have, yes, President Obama embarking on climate diplomacy to the point where last year he was able to meet with Xi Jinping, the president of China, and agree on drastic reductions. I think the US said that it would reduce its emissions by 26 to 28%, and China said that it would cut its emissions, its use of coal by 20%, and peak its emissions by the year 2030, I think it said. It didn't tell us what trajectory it would use to peak its emissions. So those of you who did mathematics know that to get from point A to a point in 2030, it all depends on, you could peak there, but at what rate are you going to go before you peak there? But anyway, and we had the groundbreaking statement earlier this week that President Obama and Prime Minister Modi of India have agreed that they would cooperate on an ambitious and successful climate change agreement. But all of this, I'm saying, the money has to come from somewhere. And when the money is coming, when the money has to be voted by a Congress that comprises people like Wicker and Inhofe, you recognize the difficulty. So that brings me very quickly to the meeting that we had with Tony Blinken and Todd Stern yesterday. The Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, informed the Caribbean prime ministers and the energy ministers who had the meeting that the United States is absolutely committed to a successful climate change agreement in Paris this year. My Prime Minister, Dr. Kenny Anthony, who has responsibility within CARICOM for sustainable development and environment, spoke on behalf of CARICOM, and he identified the critical issues that we as SIDS would like to see addressed in getting a legally binding agreement. Now, Todd Stern's reaction to that was classic. Todd said that we should not be fixated on the legally binding nature of the agreement, that we need to look at the possibilities of a blended approach because we need to get everybody to sign the agreement, including the United States. So do not be too obsessed or too fixated with getting a legally binding agreement, but be more focused on getting an agreement. So for those of us involved in the process, that's the first warning I want to issue with. Secondly, our Prime Minister made the point that climate finance is extremely important to us, and that we noted with some degree of optimism the fact that the Green Climate Fund has now been capitalized above the $10 billion mark, but it is still, that still leaves us very far short of the $100 billion by the year 2020 that has been pledged. And Todd's come back to that again was classic Todd Stern, that first of all, we have to recognize that the $100 billion by 2020 is not just money for the Green Climate Fund, which we recognize, it's part of a whole long-term finance package, but that money is not just coming from the public sector, it has to come from public sector, private sector, and other sources. He completely skirted around the Prime Minister's admonition that it should not be repackaged or reprogrammed overseas development assistance, and it had to be climate finance, and we needed a clear definition of climate finance. And finally, on the point of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, Todd said that he absolutely accepts the notion of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility. What the United States, however, does not accept is using the 1992 criteria to determine common but differentiated responsibilities. And I guess implicit in this is that certain countries, their economic status has changed since 1992. So when you talk in CBDR, don't think that the same countries that we exempted and we put as not having had a historical responsibility for climate change, and therefore it was unreal and unreasonable to expect them to bear that same share of the burden, that he's saying we have to revisit this. So for negotiators, that's the other point, and for us as ministers, that's the other point I need to raise. He did tell me, however, in a one-on-one that I had with him that stored, that he is open to working with us. He would like to, any meetings that we have, that we would like to invite him to, or his team to meet with us and discuss how we can arrive at shared positions, that he is open to that. And I think that is something that we need to be aware of and we need to use, because it's a discussion that Leon and I have had. I do not believe that we use sufficiently the fact that there should be a diplomatic, a political engagement with some of our allies on these issues before we get to the crunch of negotiations. And I think, like I said, it's something that we need to pay attention to. I spoke a little earlier about the statements by President Obama and Xi Jinping on reducing emissions, and also the statement this year with India. And I think it's another thing that we need to be very clear on. I remember being in the Seychelles with MJ when the statement on the emission cuts by the US and China was made, and the first thing I did was ask MJ, how does that mesh with the science? So when the US speaks about, I think they spoke about a 2005 baseline, how does that mesh with our own baseline, and that 26 to 28% cut, will that cause us to restrict global warming to less than 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels? The point here being that whilst the climate diplomacy is important and the bilaterals that the United States is engaged on, that these bilaterals are important, we have to ensure two things. First of all, that the statements that are made are congruent with the science. Because these things are very good photo ops, they're very good international press events, and the whole international press converges on any statement that's made on climate change by world leaders. And we have to be careful that we don't jump on the bandwagon and say, yes, great work, and we have momentum going into Paris, when what we may be doing is putting the nail in our own coffin. So we have to ensure that there is congruence between those statements and the science. And secondly, whilst it is very good in developing momentum going into Paris, we must also recognize the fact that there is a negotiating process through the UNFCCC. And we should not allow these bilaterals to take the place of the negotiating process that involves all of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change deciding what is best for the planet. So my short response to all of this is the work of President Obama in developing momentum and getting world leaders, particularly from China and from India and others. I'm sure his sights will be turned next on Brazil and some of the others. If he can break the back of Australia and Canada, then I'd say great, and Russia. Russia might be a bit of a tougher nut for him to crack. But these are good, but it is important, however, that we ensure that the statements are consistent with the science. So, having said all of this, what are our priorities going into the negotiations? First of all, climate finance. And I say this, and I look at Leon and I look at Spence, because I remember a discussion we had at one of the AOSIS coordination meetings in Lima, when Spence and Leon came to me and asked, what do you think would be the most important issue for ministers for us to discuss at this meeting? And unhesitatingly, I said to them, climate finance. And Spence immediately said to me, no. Adaptation is the most important issue. I said, yes, Spence. Adaptation is the most important issue for the negotiations. Climate finance is the most important issue to discuss with ministers. When you put climate finance on the table first, you can now start talking about adaptation and mitigation and everything else. So for us, and I'm speaking to you now, not as a technical person, but as a minister, the first most important issue for us to deal with is climate finance. Because without climate finance, we can't do any adaptation. We can't do any mitigation. So it's not diminishing the importance of adaptation. It's not diminishing the importance of mitigation, but it is coming face to face with the reality that we do not have space within our national budgets to do the things that need to be done. So the very first most important issue for us has to be climate finance. Second one has to be adaptation. Climate finance, important, first issue. Second one, adaptation. It would give me a great amount of pleasure to say adaptation and loss and damage. I will never say adaptation including loss and damage, but I guess for the timing, I have to say adaptation and loss and damage. Those two issues are extremely important for us. I want to recognize with great pleasure and satisfaction the fact that our own Orville and Dawn have been voted to represent us on the first the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. Orville and Dawn, the you have a great task ahead of you, but I'm absolutely certain that you will discharge your responsibilities to us with the competence and the passion that you've demonstrated up until now. Mitigation, as I said, extremely important. And finally, technology transfer. We have to develop consensus in these areas and speak loudly with one voice in all possible fora and negotiating theaters. Dr. Jules spoke of the collaboration with the French. Ambassador, I'm very happy for the hand of support that your government has reached out. I know that on Friday, the OECS and the French government will be launching what they call the Working Partnership on Climate Change, which really will crystallize that support by the French. I will be speaking at that, the launch of that partnership, so I will not say too much about it here, except to say that I think one area that working partnership can be extremely useful in is in the area of public education and awareness. We have to find a way to increase, when I say public education awareness, not just public education awareness domestically and in the regionally, but also internationally. It is, and it's, when I met with the ambassador maybe around 3 weeks ago, and we were discussing expectations going into Paris, and I said to him, one of the things I would like to see in Paris is an AOCS pavilion. I would like to see a SIDS pavilion in Paris, because the SIDS are the loudest voices in the negotiations. We've said that we're the moral conscience of these negotiations. But you see everybody else with spots and saying what they're about in the COPs, and you do not see a space for AOCS. Now, of course, it's because of resources, both human resources and financial resources. So I've asked Ambassador whether the French can give us some support so that we can have an AOCS, a SIDS pavilion in Lima, not populated by our negotiators. I would not want our negotiators to be there because you have other work to do, but populated by others so that we can have a presence in the negotiations and within the COP venue itself. And so we'll be working closely with Ambassador and also through the WPCC to see how that can happen.